Why would anyone confess to a crime they didn't commit? Back in 1515, the mere threat of the Iron Maiden was enough to make hundreds confess to anything, just to avoid its embrace. But did torture truly work? Or did it simply create more victims? Today we will uncover 20 medieval torture methods and discover if the stories are even worse than you've ever imagined. Let's begin with number 20. Forget quick torture. The rack was a slow-motion demolition of the human body. You were strapped down, your wrists and ankles tied to opposite ends of a giant wooden frame. The executioner would start cranking. Not fast, but inch by screaming inch. Ligaments would snap like wet rope. Shoulders popped out of their sockets. Hips tore open. Ribs strained until they fractured. The sound wasn't just bones breaking. It was the sound of you unraveling. Blood loss was minimal. The pain was biblical. The real terror was that they could stop at any time and then start again. Confess. Deny. It didn't matter. You would talk, or you would keep stretching until your skin split and you were taller by half a foot. Guy Fawkes himself was racked in 1606. Afterward, he was so mangled his signature was a shaky scribble. And the worst part, the rack didn't always kill you immediately, meaning you might just wake up in the middle of round 2. This wasn't just a collar, it was a medieval chokehold from hell. The collar of spikes was a heavy iron ring, lined with inward-facing spikes, each an inch or 2 long, positioned to dig into the throat, jawline and base of the skull. Once locked on, every movement, even breathing, drove the spikes deeper. Victims couldn't lie down without puncturing their neck. Sleep was impossible. After a few days, infections festered in the wounds. The constant blood loss left them weak, and their mind broke long before their body did. Some records from 15th century Germany describe prisoners wearing these for weeks. Their only reprieve was the brief removal for interrogation, where the real pain began. Forget being stretched. This nightmare folded you in half until your body wanted to snap. The Scavenger's Daughter, invented in 16th century England under Henry VIII, was an iron frame shaped like an A. Victims were forced into a crouch, knees to chest, head bent forward, arms clamped tight. Then the frame was locked. This crushing compression squeezed the lungs, making even shallow breathing an agony. It forced blood to surge into the head until eyes bulged and nosebleeds streamed. Chroniclers mention noble prisoners in the Tower of London, collapsing into unconsciousness after mere minutes. It was the twisted opposite of the rack not pulling you apart, but compacting you into a ball of suffering. Burning at the stake. It wasn't just flames. It was theater, fear, and slow execution, all in one. Burning at the stake was used across medieval Europe for heresy, witchcraft, and treason. Public squares packed with thousands came to watch. The victim was chained to a post, often with green wood stacked around them so the fire burned slower, prolonging the agony. In England's Marian persecutions, from 1555 to 1558, over 280 Protestants were burned, some taking more than 30 minutes to die. The stench was unforgettable. For rulers, it was more than punishment. It was propaganda, a warning carved in fire, against anyone daring to defy the crown or the church. Says pressing, peine forte et dure. In medieval England and France, peine forte et dure crushed not only bodies but wills. It was a grim loophole used on accused criminals who refused to plead. No plea meant no conviction, so their property stayed with the family. The victim lay naked on the ground, a board placed across their chest. Weights, first stones, then heavier iron slabs, were added slowly. The pressure made ribs snap like twigs and lungs collapse. In 1692, during the Salem witch trials, Giles Corey was pressed for 2 days. His last recorded words, "More weight. Pressing was torture disguised as legal process, a calculated mix of pain and psychological warfare. 15. Crocodile shears. If you were guilty of treason in late medieval Europe, execution wasn't just about death. It was about making a public example. The crocodile shears were forged iron tongs with 4 or more serrated jaws, shaped like a crocodile's mouth. Heated until glowing red, they were clamped around the offender's fingers, toes, or worse. The teeth didn't just pierce. They bit deep, tearing flesh and splintering bone. The point wasn't just pain, it was spectacle. The crowd could hear the hiss of burning flesh and the victims' screams over the executioners, hammering blows. 14. Strappado. If medieval torture had a sound, it would be the sickening crack of tearing ligaments from the strappado. The victims' hands were tied behind their back. A rope was looped around the wrists and hoisted over a high beam. With one sudden drop, the full body weight wrenched the shoulders out of their sockets, often on the first pull. The pain was so intense it could cause permanent paralysis or death from shock. In Florence's Piazza della Signoria, it became a public stage for hoistings, the crowd watching bones snap while the accused screamed confessions. 13. The Branks. If you thought medieval punishment was all blood and broken bones, think again. The Branks, or Scold's Bridle, proved psychological torture could be just as devastating. Emerging in 16th century Scotland, it targeted women accused of gossip or nagging. The device was an iron cage fitted over the head with a flat plate forced into the mouth, sometimes with spikes to tear the tongue if she tried to speak. Women were paraded through town while crowds jeered and threw filth. It left no fatal wounds, but the emotional and physical scars could last a lifetime. 12. The Garrote. The garrote was execution by slow strangulation, but with a brutal twist. The victim was seated, and an iron collar was locked around their neck. A screw or lever at the back was turned slowly, pressing a metal bolt into the spine or throat. Early versions caused slow asphyxiation. Later models added a sharpened point that crushed the cervical vertebrae instantly. The psychological horror was profound. The victim sat calmly, feeling the cold iron, knowing the next twist could either choke them slowly or break their neck in one snap. 11. The pillory and stocks. The pillory and stocks weren't just public shaming devices. They were slow-motion torture machines. A condemned person, locked in place for hours or days, became a living target. Crowds hurled rotten food, dung, stones, and even boiling liquids. In 1623 London, a man accused of fraud died in the pillory after a stone crushed his skull. Survival depended not on the sentence, but on the mood of the mob. 10. The coffin torture. The coffin torture was exactly what it sounded like. An iron cage shaped to fit a human body, sometimes barely larger than the victim. Used across medieval Europe, the condemned were stripped naked, locked inside and hung in public squares. They were left to starve, dehydrate, or freeze. In more sadistic cases, executioners smeared them with honey to attract insects. The sight of the corpse, ribs protruding and flesh rotting, was meant to stick in the minds of anyone considering the same crime. 9. The knee splitter. The knee splitter wasn't a subtle device. Picture 2 opposing metal plates, each lined with spikes, clamped around the knee and screwed tighter until the joint shattered. It wasn't meant to kill outright. It was designed to destroy the body's ability to move. Victims were often left permanently lame, crawling rather than walking. No battlefield injury was this precise. This was targeted destruction, ensuring agony lasted a lifetime. 8. Tarring and feathering. If burning at the stake was hellfire, tarring and feathering was hellfire with glue. Used on pirates and mutineers as a warning, the victim was stripped and lashed to a post. Boiling tar, heated to over 200 degrees, was poured or brushed directly onto the skin. The tar bonded to flesh, sealing in heat and causing deep, blackened blisters. Finally, the victim was set alight, turned into a human torch. This was a sentence designed for horror as much as death. 7. Thumb screws. Forget grand executions. Thumb screws were torture condensed into the size of a book clasp. This small iron device clamped over the fingers or thumbs and was tightened by a screw. Each twist drove the metal deeper, crushing bone, bursting nails, and tearing skin. A skilled torturer could prolong the ordeal for hours, using just enough pressure to maim without killing. Prison records from 1620s. Germany mentioned thieves begging for the gallows instead of another round. 6. The chair of nails. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary wooden chair until you saw the hundreds of iron spikes covering every surface. Victims were stripped and strapped down, their own body weight driving the spikes into flesh. The spikes were often heated red-hot first, turning the torture into a combination of impalement and burning. Tight leather straps ensured you couldn't shift to relieve pressure. Every twitch drove the points deeper. This wasn't just a chair, it was a throne of agony. 5. The iron gag. The iron gag was a punishment designed to make breathing itself unbearable. It was a metal clamp forced deep into the mouth, pressing the tongue down, while a sharpened edge dug into the roof of the mouth. Victims were locked in place with iron straps around the head. Every movement of the jaw or attempt to breathe scraped tender flesh. The iron gag silenced more than words. It crushed the will. 4. The drunkard's cloak. In 17th century England, public drunkenness was shamed into memory. The drunkard's cloak was literally a beer barrel with holes cut for the head and arms. Offenders were shoved inside and marched through town while children threw mud and stones. In winter, the damp wood froze against skin, causing frostbite. What began as a comedic punishment could end in dehydration or even death. It was humiliation weaponized. 3. The Spanish tickler. This wasn't a farm tool. It was a murder weapon disguised as one. The Spanish tickler, also called the cat's claw, looked like an iron rake with curved prongs. Victims were chained to walls, and the claw was raked across bare skin, shredding muscle and tendons. Often the claws were heated until glowing red, searing flesh as they tore it away. The Spanish tickler was about unmaking a person, piece by piece, in front of an audience. 2. The breaking wheel. Also called the Catherine wheel, this method wasn't just about killing. It was about destroying the human body in front of a crowd. Victims were tied to a massive wooden wheel, limbs spread. The executioner used an iron cudgel to smash bones, starting from the legs and working upward. Sometimes the victim was left alive, their broken body woven through the wheel's spokes and hoisted high on a pole for all to see. This was public theater of pain, meant to echo in memory for decades. 1. Scaphism. If hell had a waiting room, it would be scaphism. This method trapped the victim between two hollowed-out boats or planks, with only the head, hands, and feet exposed. Executioners force-fed them milk and honey until violent diarrhea set in, then smeared the exposed skin with more honey to lure insects. Bound helplessly, the victim floated on a stagnant pond. Flies, wasps, and ants swarmed the body, laying eggs in open sores. Death could take over a week as flesh rotted alive. It wasn't just execution, it was erasure. Thanks for braving history's darkest corners. If you want more shocking true stories from the past, be sure to like, subscribe, and watch our next video, because the Middle Ages were just the beginning of human cruelty.
À mort le tyran! Vive la nation!
The dawn of May 19th, 1536, was unnaturally still over the Tower of London, the air cold enough to steal your breath and thick with a morbid anticipation. The select crowd of nobles and London officials was packed tightly. Within the inner courtyard, a low murmur humming through them. You could taste their fear, their excitement, their grim satisfaction. And at the center of this macabre theater stood Anne Boleyn, a queen dethroned. This was the woman whose dark eyes and sharp wit had captivated a king, the very reason England had shattered its ancient bonds with the Church of Rome. Now she stood alone, blamed for everything from treason and adultery to witchcraft and incest, the convenient scapegoat for a king's waning affection and a nation's turmoil. She had heard the whispers of a devil's mark on her neck, the jeers of the public who once adored her. She ascended the cold wooden scaffold, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Dressed in a grey damask gown over a crimson kirtle, her eyes were remarkably steady, fixed on some distant point beyond the walls, perhaps on a memory of Hever Castle, or the glittering court she once commanded. She spoke briefly, her voice clear but strained, praying for the king and asserting she died his loyal subject. A French swordsman, specially imported from Calais for his expertise with a single, clean stroke, stepped forward. He was her final peculiar mercy. He offered a distraction, a murmured request for forgiveness. And as she turned her head to absolve him, the world became a blur of motion. The blade flashed, a silent arc in the morning light. One moment she was a queen offering grace. The next, her head lay severed in the straw, her dark eyes wide open, her lips still moving in silent prayer. Blood, shockingly red, soaked into the wood and straw. The crowd, for a single collective heartbeat, was utterly, profoundly silent. Even the seasoned executioner looked pale. And as her body was bundled into an old arrow chest, King Henry VIII, miles away, was already preparing to hunt, his heart and his bed soon to be filled by Jane Seymour. Anne's death stunned Europe, a chilling lesson written in blood. Kings wrote frantic letters. Poets were inspired by the tragic muse. And in the gilded corridors of power, every ambitious woman learned the brutal, final price of crossing a king. Anne was gone, but the legend of the queen who lost her head had just begun. The morning of January 21st, 1793, was a festival of bloodlust. Paris awoke not to the sound of birds, but to the drumming of a revolution that had turned on its father. The air was bitingly cold, but the city was feverish. King Louis XVI's final journey was a slow, grim procession through streets lined with a staggering 80,000 armed guards, their bayonets glinting like a field of steel. The city was a powder keg, and any wrong word, any sign of royalist sympathy could trigger a massacre. Women, men, and even children scrambled onto rooftops and crowded every window for a better view, their breath misting in the frigid air. Louis, the king who had tried to flee his people in the disastrous flight to Varennes, now rode in a simple, rattling cart, his face ashen, his hands clutching a final confession. He was a prisoner of the nation he failed to understand. At the Place de la Révolution, the executioner Charles-Henri Sanson, a fourth-generation master of death who had turned the act into a chillingly efficient science, waited patiently by his machine. The guillotine, nicknamed the National Razor, stood stark against the grey sky. Louis, with a dignity that surprised many, climbed the steps. He tried to address the sea of faces, to speak a final word to his people. "Frenchmen, I die innocent," he began, but a furious roll of drums cut him off, his last words swallowed by the revolution's relentless beat. It took 4 of Sanson's assistants to strap his portly frame to the bascule, the tilting board, The lunette, the heavy wooden collar, was slammed down over his neck. Then, the weighted blade, freshly oiled for a smooth descent, dropped with a sickening metallic rush. The king's head fell into the waiting basket. For a second there was silence, and then the square erupted. A primal roar of cheers, screams, and sobs filled the air. Men pushed forward, dipping handkerchiefs and scraps of paper into the royal blood, seeking grisly souvenirs of a fallen age. Within hours, rumors swirled that the blade was too dull, that his eyes blinked after death, that he had suffered. The city was divided, unable to agree if it had witnessed the dawn of justice or the descent into barbarism. The monarchy was dead, but the terror had just been born. February 8, 1587 dawned with a thick, clinging fog that shrouded Fotheringhay Castle in a ghostly pall. For 19 years, Mary, Queen of Scots, had been a prisoner of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, a living, breathing threat to the Protestant throne. Now her final hour had come. She entered the great hall, which had been converted into an execution chamber, with a regal composure that silenced the gathered witnesses. She was dressed not for death, but for martyrdom, in a striking gown of deep crimson velvet, the liturgical color of sacrifice in the Catholic faith. Her prayers, spoken in a firm, clear voice, were those of a devout Catholic, a deliberate and defiant act in this Protestant stronghold. She knelt at the block, laying her head upon the rough wood. Her final words are whispered, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." But the executioner, a man known as Bull, was nervous and unprepared, his breath sour with the stench of cheap ale. The first swing of the axe was not a clean strike. It was a hack, a brutal chop that buried the blade deep into the back of her skull. A muffled groan escaped her lips. The second blow was worse, a crushing impact that severed muscle and bone but failed to fully separate her head. From her body, the head now hung by a grisly thread of tissue. Panicked, the drunken Axeman was forced to grab her hair and saw through the remaining flesh with his knife. The crowd, which had expected a swift judicial act, was utterly sickened. Some gasped, others turned away to vomit. Then, a movement from beneath the Queen's voluminous skirts. Her small terrier, who had hidden there, emerged, whining piteously and circling her body, its fur becoming soaked in her blood. When the executioner finally lifted the head to show the crowd, a final indignity occurred. Her auburn wig came away in his hand, revealing the short grey hair of a woman aged by decades of imprisonment. The botched three-stroke killing was not the clean justice Elizabeth's government had hoped for. It became a powerful symbol of political murder, a martyrdom that would fuel Catholic resistance for generations. Mary had lost her life, but in her gruesome death, she won a powerful legacy. October 16th, 1793. Paris awoke once more, hungry for royal blood. The widow Capet, once the most dazzling and despised woman in Europe, Marie Antoinette, had been broken by her imprisonment. She spent her last night in a dank cell in the conciergerie, her hair turned white and hacked short by the jailer's shears, her body withered by months of neglect and grief. She was a ghost of the Austrian horror the mob so despised. When the guards came for her, they bound her hands behind her back and forced her into a common wooden cart for the long, torturous ride through the heart of Paris. She was paraded through streets that reeked of sewage and revolutionary fervor. The crowds lining the route were a wall of hatred, screaming, spitting, and hurling rotten vegetables. Death to the tyrant! Death to the Austrian she-wolf! Yet through it all she maintained an almost supernatural composure, her head held high, her eyes looking straight ahead, as if viewing a different, more elegant world. At the Place de la Révolution, the same platform that had claimed her husband 10 months prior, she ascended the steps with a quiet dignity that, for a moment, hushed the cacophony. Her legendary haughtiness was gone, replaced by the weary resolve of a mother who had lost everything. In a final heartbreaking moment of ingrained royal etiquette, she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot. Her last recorded words were not a curse or a political statement, but a simple automatic apology. "Pardon me. Sir, I did not do it on purpose." She offered no resistance as she was strapped to the plank. The heavy, angled blade of the guillotine fell with a definitive thud. The crowd's roar this time was even more frenzied than for the king. The revolution had truly consumed its greatest symbol of excess. Moments after her head fell, the frenzy continued as strangers scrambled, not for souvenirs, but to dip their hands and rags in the pool of her blood, as if to physically confirm the death of the monarchy itself. The queen was gone, and with her the last vestiges of the old world. The morning of January 30th, 1649, was one of the coldest London had ever known. A silence, heavy and unnatural, lay over Whitehall. For the first time in history, a divinely appointed king was to be publicly executed by order of his own subjects. King Charles I, stripped of his title and now simply Charles Stuart, was led from St. James's Palace to a black-draped scaffold built outside the banqueting house, a building whose glorious ceiling, painted by Rubens, celebrated the divine right of the very monarchy he was about to die for. He was dressed with meticulous care, wearing 2 thick shirts so the shivering from the cold would not be mistaken for fear by the vast, silent crowd that watched from behind a wall of soldiers. He addressed those few close enough to hear, his voice steady, declaring himself a martyr of the people. He stated that a subject and a sovereign are clean, different things, and that he died for the liberty of his people, whom he believed had been led astray. He then knelt and placed his head upon the low block. A masked executioner and his assistant stood ready. Their identities were the state's most closely guarded secret, for no one wanted to be remembered as the man who killed a king. The executioner, it was said, was shaking more than the king. With a single practiced motion, the axe fell once, severing the king's head cleanly from his body. A unified guttural groan, a sound of collective shock and awe, rippled through the thousands of onlookers. Some fainted, others surged forward, their handkerchiefs soaking up the royal blood, which they believed held miraculous healing powers. England was now a commonwealth, a kingless nation. The executioner and his assistant vanished into the annals of history, their names expunged from records, their fate a mystery, forever ghosts in the story they helped write. The killing of a king was an act so profound that its echo would shape the course of British history for centuries to come. In the early hours of July 17, 1918, in the oppressive heat of a Yekaterinburg summer, the 3-century-old Romanov dynasty was about to be extinguished in a damp cellar room. The House of Special Purpose held its last. Tragic occupants, the former Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, their 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, their frail son Alexei, and their few remaining loyal servants. They were told to dress and come downstairs, under the pretext that they were being moved to a safer location due to unrest in the city. Trusting, or perhaps simply resigned, they followed their captors into a small, barren room with a single barred window. Yakov Yurovsky, the head of the execution squad, entered and read the sentence aloud. In view of the fact that your relatives are continuing their attack on Soviet Russia, the Ural Executive Committee has decided to execute you." The family was stunned into silence. There was no time to react. Suddenly, the door swung open, and a squad of 11 men, some drunk on vodka for courage, filed in, raising their revolvers. The shooting began instantly. The room, barely 13 by 15 feet, became a hellish echo chamber of gunshots, screams, and the ricochet of bullets. The daughters, who had sewn vast quantities of jewels into their corsets as a safeguard for the future, were initially protected. Gems deflected the first volley of bullets. What followed was not an execution, but a frenzied massacre. As the smoke cleared, the killers saw that many of their victims were still alive, moaning in agony. They then moved in with bayonets and rifle butts, stabbing and bludgeoning until the room fell silent. The floor was a slick, horrific pool of blood. The bodies were then hauled away, stripped, burned with acid, and dumped in a secret mine shaft in the Koptyaki forest. The Bolsheviks had not just killed a family, they had attempted to erase them from the earth, a cold, clinical act that ended an empire not with the revolution's cheer, but with a massacre's whisper. Just one day after the Romanov massacre, on July 18, 1918, another act of revolutionary vengeance unfolded in the remote town of Alapayevsk. The victims included Princess Elizabeth Feodorovna, the beloved sister of the late Tsarina Alexandra, a German princess by birth. She had founded the Martha and Mary Convent in Moscow after her husband's assassination, dedicating her life to charity and faith. She was a nun, not a political figure, but her royal blood was a death sentence. Along with 5 other Romanov relatives and a loyal servant, she was taken by a band of Bolshevik guards to an abandoned iron mine shaft, a deep, ragged wound in the earth. There was no pretense of a trial. The prisoners were brutally beaten with rifle butts, their valuables ripped from them. Elizabeth, despite her age of 53, remained eerily calm, her hands folded in prayer. One by one, they were hurled still alive into the 60-foot-deep pit. The Bolsheviks, hearing moans and hymns rising from the darkness, responded not with mercy but with brutality. They tossed down several hand grenades, followed by heavy wooden beams, to ensure the job was finished. For days afterward, peasants from a nearby village reported hearing the slow, painful singing of hymns, most likely from the seriously injured but still conscious Elizabeth and her fellow sufferers, echoing from the depths of the mine. When a White Army unit discovered the site weeks later, they found Elizabeth's body at the bottom, her fingers still frozen in the sign of the cross. Her death was not the swift, public spectacle of a guillotine, but a slow, private, and agonizing descent into darkness, a chilling testament to the revolution's determination to purge Russia of its past, one soul at a time. The morning of May 30th, 1431, in the old market square of Rouen was a scene of grim spectacle. A 19-year-old peasant girl, Joan of Arc, was led out to face her accusers and her death. For months, she had been tried by a pro-English church court, accused of heresy and witchcraft for the voices that had led her to rally the French army and crown a king. Now, broken by imprisonment and threatened with rape, she had recanted, only to retract her confession days later, choosing faith over fear. Dressed in a simple, shapeless white shift, the garment of an unrepentant heretic, she was chained to a tall pillar of plaster, surrounded by a pyramid of wood and straw soaked in sulfur and pitch. The English soldiers surrounding the platform jeered, while the presiding bishop, Pierre Cauchon, looked on with cold satisfaction. As the flames were lit, she asked for a cross, An English soldier, moved by pity, fashioned a small one from 2 sticks and handed it to her. She clutched it to her chest as the fire began to lick at her feet. The smoke, thick and black, billowed around her, and as she began to choke, witnesses swore they heard her cry out, "Jesus, Jesus!" repeatedly, invoking the name of her Savior until the very end. The burning was agonizingly slow. The executioner, Geoffroy Thérage, later confessed he was so terrified of being damned for burning a saint that he ensured the fire was built high to hasten her death from smoke inhalation rather than the flames. When the fire finally died down, the English, fearing her remains would become holy relics, ordered her body to be burned twice more until it was reduced to ashes, which were then scattered into the Seine River. They believed they were erasing a heretic, but they had in fact created a martyr and a legend that would, in time, become the patron saint of France. In the bloody aftermath of the Jacobite rebellion of 1745, the government in London was determined to make an example that would echo through the Highlands for generations. The romantic cause of Bonnie Prince Charlie was dead on the field of Culloden, and now the reckoning began. Tower Hill in London was transformed from a place of occasional high-profile executions into a grim, efficient assembly line for aristocratic blood. Over several months in 1746 and 1747, a procession of Scottish lords, clan chieftains, and officers, many of them barely out of their teens, their lives defined by loyalty to the Stuart cause, were dragged to the scaffold. The executioners, their faces hidden by grim black masks, were professionals whose identities were a state secret. The victims, men like the elderly Lord Lovat or the dashing James Radcliffe, Earl of Derwentwater, met their ends with a courage that often moved the hostile London crowd to a grudging silence. The axe would fall, and the head would be held aloft with the traditional cry, "Behold the head of a traitor!" But the spectacle did not end there. The government, in a calculated act of psychological warfare, ordered that the heads of the most prominent rebels be piked and placed on spikes and publicly displayed on Temple Bar and London Bridge, where they would slowly decompose, grisly weather vanes pointing the way to treason's end. The bodies were often handed over to anatomists for public dissection, a final humiliating desecration. This was not merely justice, it was a systematic, terrifying display of state power designed to crush not just a rebellion, but the very culture and spirit that had fueled it. The final act in our gallery of royal deaths feels less like a formal execution and more like a brutal, back-alley gangland murder. In the heart of the Ottoman Empire, on May 20th, 1622, a profound taboo was broken. Sultan Osman II, a young, ambitious ruler of just 18 years, was seized by his own elite troops, the Janissaries, and imprisoned in the dreaded fortress of Yedikul. Osman, a modernizer who dreamed of reforming the bloated, conservative empire, had made a fatal error. He planned to disband the Janissary Corps after a humiliating military loss. Viewing them as obsolete, the Janissaries, getting wind of this, struck first. They rioted, stormed the Topkapi Palace, and forced the young sultan to abdicate in favor of his mentally unstable uncle. But that was not enough. To ensure he could never return to power, they decided on a final, ruthless solution. In his sparse cell, Osman was set upon by a group of executioners. There was no scaffold, no public ceremony, no royal blade. The chosen instrument was a simple bowstring, the traditional method for dispatching royalty without shedding blood, which was considered noble. But Osman was no passive victim. The teenage sultan, stripped of his royal robes, fought back with the desperate strength of a cornered animal. He scratched, he bit, he kicked, pleading for his life as the men struggled to subdue him. The struggle was so violent, it was reported that one of the executioners broke his own fingers. Finally, they managed to loop the string around his neck and strangle him to death. His body was then presented to the public as proof of his demise. A shocking sight that sent tremors through Istanbul. A sultan had been killed by his own guards, an act so heinous it shattered the inviolable mystique of the Ottoman throne and inaugurated a period of deep instability, proving that the greatest threat to a ruler often came not from foreign enemies, but from the palace walls themselves.